Um, Welcome everyone to the first SSP Wednesday seminar for the fall 2020 semester, coming to you live from all of our various Zoom cameras. I wish we could be in E40, and I hope that we'll all be back in E40 soon. I'm Taylor Fravel, the director of the Security Studies program, and I'm especially delighted today to welcome Fred Kaplan, who is the national security columnist for Slate magazine and the author of 6 books. One which is sort of well known within our community is The Wizards of Armageddon. But today he'll be speaking about a new book, The Bomb, Presidents, Generals, and the Secret History of Nuclear War. Sort of more importantly, or more sort of special from the perspective of MIT and SSP is that Fred received his PhD from the Political Science Department and was part of what was then known as DAX, SSP's predecessor, and was around on campus. And Fred's might not like it if I say this, in the late 1970s. So he really actually carries with him the history of the program as well. So it's really special for us to have Fred here today. He's also a former fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and the America Foundation, a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist for the Boston Globe as well. So please join me in welcoming Fred. And Fred, let me turn over the virtual screen to you. Welcome.
Okay, well, thanks very much. It's good to be there, even at some distance. Yeah, this speakers program was sort of created when I was a graduate student here. And as you said, it was called DAX, which was, I think it stood for Defense and Arms Control Studies Seminar. It was invented by a fellow student. And, basically speakers would come in and we would murder them. So, I invite a retribution of karma against myself. It's the least that I can do. So basically, I'm going to talk about what I like to call not a revisionist, but the real history of nuclear strategy and thinking about nuclear war and nuclear weapons. There's a tendency, because these theories of deterrence and warfighting and so forth have been around for so long, there is a tendency for some people to talk about them as if they were real, as if they were based on something. In the same way that one would talk about, macroeconomic theory in an economics course, even while knowing that it doesn't quite fit the reality, the principles are based on something. Whereas here, it's really based more on wishful thinking and bureaucratic politics. So I'm going to go into that. I think the origins of nuclear strategy, it kind of starts right before the bomb, in the spring of 1945. The Nazis had surrendered already, but the Japanese were continuing to fight. And General Hap Arnold, who was the head of the Army Air Forces, as it was called at the time, asked General Curtis LeMay, who was then firebombing all of Japan as commander of the 21st Bomber Command, when the war is going to be over. And he took the question to his staff, and the staff did the calculations, how many tons can be delivered to these targets, when, where, and so forth. And he came back and he said, the war will be over on September 1st, because that is when basically every square mile of Japan will have been incinerated. So this was LeMay's philosophy of war in the aerial age, which is just bomb everything. So the atom bomb disrupted his timetable, but also made his notion of warfare seemingly more plausible. So he became the commander of Strategic Air Command and whipped it into a genuine operational unit. And during the 50s, as most of you know, there was a policy called massive retaliation during the Eisenhower era. It was generally thought that there might very well be a war with the Soviet Union. And Eisenhower thought that if there is such a war, it will almost certainly go nuclear very soon, and that would be a disaster. And so what we had to do was to raise the stakes so high that even the rapacious Soviet bear would be deterred from invading West Germany or occupying Berlin or something. So, but by the late 50s, by 1960, when we had the first single integrated operational plan, the PSYOP, the first war plan, here was the plan, and there wasn't plan B, this was it. That if the Soviets invaded West Germany or occupied West Berlin or really occupied any spot of vital territory, not if they used nuclear weapons, that had nothing to do with it, they didn't even have any at the time, but if they occupied, then the plan was to fire all of our nuclear weapons, our entire nuclear arsenal, as quickly as possible against every target in the Soviet Union, satellite nations of Eastern Europe, and communist China, even if China had nothing to do with the war. Somebody asked, well, how many people are going to get killed in this? It was 285 million people, 285 million. And that probably did not include fallout against even Western Europe. This was mainly just blast, because that was what could easily be calculated. So that was the plan, and everybody approved it. And then something in the early 60s, what happened was, and it was anticipated in the late 50s, was that the Soviet Union started to develop its own long-range nuclear arsenal. And so this kind of raised some questions. If the Russians invade West Germany and we nuke them, they could nuke us. And so this raised two problems. One, it's a suicide pact. And two, it doesn't have much credibility as a strategy, because why would we invite our own destruction? And so people started thinking about other things. Some people started talking about, well, we need to have a conventional defense in Western Europe. That was very expensive at the time, still is. Then others said, well, we have to come up with some ideas for limited nuclear war. And the standard scenario was, okay, let's say the Soviets invade Western Europe. We, with some of our weapons, knock out their strategic rocket forces. And then we tell them, okay, we still have a bunch of weapons left over and you've got very few. If you attack us, we're going to unleash the rest of our stuff on your cities. And, as you know, there were some theorists like Herman Kahn who extended this into incredibly elaborate, Baroque, Herman Kahn in his book On Escalation envisioned 38 rungs of escalation. All of this grew out of actually the opposite of bloody-mindedness. It was a way to keep the war limited, to try to bring it to a halt as quickly as possible. And in fact, McNamara, Secretary of Defense, drew up new guidance for a PSYOP, which contained several limited options. Like under this option, we don't hit anything in China. Under this option, we only hit military targets that are away from cities. And anyway, it was very, very precise. Now, there's one thing, if you read The Wizards of Armageddon, which I wrote in 1983, there's one thing I get wrong in that book. There was nothing as yet declassified about McNamara's new PSYOP 63. And so I got all of my information about that from the people who helped write it in the Pentagon, in the Joint Staff. Well, revisiting that now with my new book, I realized there's a lot more declassified now. It turns out that SAC paid no attention to this guidance. Basically, they had the Joint Staff write into the guidance, after any mention of limited options and restraint and things like that, they would insert the phrase, if it is operationally feasible, or if it is consistent with military objectives. And then, of course, the targeting people out at SAC would look at that and conclude that it was not operationally feasible and it was not consistent with military objectives. And so they just ignored it. So when Henry Kissinger becomes Nixon's national security advisor in 1969. And by the way, I'm abbreviating a lot of this. I'm capsizing history here. But when he had been an advisor for a while in the Kennedy administration and knew about the various tabletop exercises that were being played about limited options and so forth. And if you want, we can talk in some detail about a very neat first strike plan that was drawn up during the Berlin crisis of 1961. But anyway, he gets the PSYOP briefing with Nixon, and he realizes that nothing had changed, that all these elaborate things that McNamara had put in were not translated into the operational plan. And so he set into motion some new studies for limited operations. There was this whole multi-volume thing called NUOPS, which was either stood for nuclear operations or nuclear options. And again, they came up with, the technology had improved a bit, so they came up with very elaborate options. But anytime they played it, they couldn't figure out how this would work. They could send these elaborate, signals with force, like very Tom Schelling kinds of signals. There was no evidence that the Russians, A, would get the signal, or B, would have any inclination to play this tit for tat game along with us. And there was plenty of evidence that they wouldn't. There was also a problem, and this is really one reason besides the LeMay cult, that the people out at SAC didn't want to pursue this very much. Once you have one exchange of nuclear weapons, no matter how few or many, the plausibility that you might actually get in another round was doubtful. The command control might be completely shot. The link between the people ordering the weapons be fired and the others down in the silos or in the submarines or at the bomber bases. The president might be dead. The delegation of authority was very weak. So it was really in serious doubt whether this had any reality whatsoever. But people continued because, look, early on, the people who started doing this at the beginning, and several of them told me this, including one who used to be a professor at mine at MIT, Bill Kaufman, who sort of invented the first counterforce theory. He said, look, if you'd asked us to play odds on what are the chances that this would really work, it would have been very low. We didn't really quite believe it. But the thinking was, look, this might happen. And the big thing was you want to give the president more options. If the president comes to you and says, okay, this is happening, what can I do that doesn't involve blowing up the entire planet? Your job was not to say, sorry, Mr. President, we've got nothing for you. The idea was to come up with something for him. And as I say, the more that this grew ingrained in the thinking of the strategists, the more it was assumed that this was kind of based on something real. Let me back up 1 minute to show about the artificiality of this. I gave you the intellectual origins of, say, the counterforce, limited nuclear war, no cities doctrine. Where did it really come from? Well, there was, if you go, some documents that I got declassified when I was writing Wizards indicated very clearly that the upper ranks of the Navy and the Air Force hated each other with possibly more passion than either one of them hated the Soviet Union. I mean, I'm not exaggerating at all. So basically, when the Air Force, in 1950, there was a big battle between the Air Force and the Navy on whether to fund the B-36 bomber or the supercarrier. It was nuclear weapons and non-nuclear. And the Navy argued, they were kind of in an awkward situation because on the one hand, they argued, the nuclear weapons, they really aren't even that effective. One guy testified, if you set off a nuclear weapon on one end of National Airport's runway and you stood on the other end with nothing more than a shirt on your back, you're not going to get hurt. On the other hand, they said, this whole idea of blowing up cities, this is just incredibly immoral. This is ghastly. This is awful. And in fact, then they came up with the Polaris submarine at the end of the decade. And they thought, okay, we're going to throw SAC out of business. Because the Polaris submarine, it wasn't accurate at all. But if the whole idea was just to bomb stuff, it could do that really well. And also you could have what then became known as finite deterrence. It was underwater. It wasn't going to be able to get attacked, unlike missile base silos and bomber bases. So you only need so many submarines with so many missiles, and that's all you need. And we'll just blow up cities. And so the Air Force, they said, oh shit, we've been outplayed. And there's a memo from the Chief of Staff of the Air Force to Tommy Power, who was LeMay's successor as commander of SEC, saying, you know, we have emphasized retaliation too much in our discussions of deterrence. We have to talk more openly about taking the initiative. And then Kaufman comes along at the RAND Corporation with this briefing on this counterforce doctrine. And they said, that's it. In fact, RAND had a contract with the Air Force. So the title of Kaufman's first counterforce briefing was The Polaris Problem. That's what it was. It was, what do we do about this Polaris? And so he came up with this idea where you need accurate, more powerful weapons and some ability to be restrained. And so the Air Force adopted counterforce for that reason. And in fact, there's this memo from Tommy Power back to the Chief of Staff saying, what are you doing? This is a crazy idea. Because once Kaufman had briefed Tommy Power, and Power just went nuts. And at one point toward the end, he goes, why are you talking about restraint? Look, at the end of the war, if there are two of us and one of them, we win. And Kaufman said, well, I hope that it's a man and a woman, and Power stormed out of the room. So the Chief of Staff assured him, don't worry, we're going to keep doing what we've always been doing, but we need to do this for political reasons. So the whole business of counterforce as adopted as an actual policy was just, and then much later, cut ahead for just a minute, the Navy comes up with the Trident II missile in the 70s, which has counterforce capability, and all of a sudden they're very much in favor of counterforce too. So, you know, where you stand is where you sit, or where you sit is where you stand, whatever that slogan of bureaucratic politics, that very much drives what was going on with, in fact, many years later, when generals and admirals started speaking out against things like the MX missile and stuff like that, they were usually Navy admirals who didn't like that kind of missile, Marines who had never been involved with long-range nuclear weapons anyway, and Army generals who had been beat out by the Air Force to be in charge of the ICBM program. So they were kind of self-interested generals and admirals who became part of the anti-nuclear brigade around the time of the freeze and so forth. So moving on ahead, the PSYOP pretty much stayed the same until the 1980s, really until very near the end of the Cold War, when a civil service guy in the Pentagon who was in charge of strategic planning named Frank Miller, whom some of you might know, he read up on all of this stuff. He looked at all the then still classified guidances from Kissinger and McNamara and all the others about limited options and restraint and so forth. And then he sits with Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney to get the briefing on the PSYOP. And he notices, what's going on there? There's nothing said here about restraint or limited options or anything. And Cheney ordered him to take his team and go out to Omaha, SAC headquarters, and dig deep into the PSYOP. What has really been going on? Nobody had really ever done this before. So he gets into it extremely deep, and he discovers some amazing thing. I mean, you know, we all talk about overkill. The degree of overkill was just stunning. I mean, for example, one of his assistants drew a circle comprising like a 50-mile radius around Moscow. And it turned out there were 700 nuclear weapons aimed within this circle. I mean, all at discrete targets, but they were overlapping, you know. And these were mainly weapons in the megatons range. There was a bomber base in the Arctic Circle. This wasn't even a primary base. This was a secondary base for bombers to land in after they bombed America. And it was so cold, it couldn't be used for 2/3 of the year. 17 nuclear weapons were aimed at this bomber base. There was an ABM site near Sheremetyevo Airport outside of Moscow. which we found out after the Cold War ended was completely worthless in terms of shooting down missiles. There were 68 warheads aimed at this ABM site. And also there was nothing of what you might call nodal analysis. So for example, if the mission was to destroy the Russian tank army, there would be weapons aimed at the tanks in the divisions, then other missiles aimed at, or bombers aimed at the factories making the tanks, others at the factory making the spare parts for the factories making the tanks, others for the mines where they were rolling. I mean, it was just incredibly redundant. And then came the final moment of revelation. George H.W. Bush at that time was negotiating strategic arms reduction treaty with Russia. And so one of Miller's assistants went to the guy he dealt with, a colonel in the Joint Strategic Target Planning Staff at SAC, which was what's called, and said, if we reduce the number of our weapons to such and such, would you still be able to carry out your mission? And he goes, that's not the kind of question we ask. He goes, well, let me rephrase. He goes, no, I understand what you're saying, but that's not what we do here. What we do here is we take the number of weapons that we have and we apply them to our target list. So that's the thing. This was completely mechanical. There's that book that Alan Enthoven, McNamara's chief whiz kid, wrote, How Much is Enough? Turns out nobody had really asked that question. They'd asked it in Washington, but not in a way that it could be operationally translated to the people out at SAC. And at SAC, that wasn't their thing. There was a commander of SAC in the 80s named Jack Chain, who at one hearing said, I need 10,000 weapons because I have 10,000 targets. And people thought maybe he was joking or maybe he's not very bright. But no, that is exactly how they did things. That's how they did things. So Miller and his crew went through and went down the entire target list. And so, they had about 12,000 weapons at the time. And they said, okay, is this really a target? Do we really need to hit this target? If we do we really need 2 weapons on it or 3 weapons? Couldn't we do 1 instead of 2? Anyway, they whittled down the requirements, by the way, without changing the guidance at all, without changing anything about what the war aim was, or just given X, how many weapons do we need? And they whittled it down to about 6,000. Actually, it was 5,888. And I know that because one of Miller's assistants wanted to put 5888 on his license plate as kind of an inside joke. He decided not to do that. So anyway, by the time Bush negotiated a treaty which reduced the number of weapons to about that amount, the military was cool with it because they'd seen that they had really been playing this ridiculous game all these years. And it was so compartmentalized that even strategic people in the Joint Staff had no idea that this was going on in Omaha. And then when the Soviet Union split up and Eastern Europe was no longer part of it, they had to take out all the targets that were in Eastern Europe. And by the way, that was a lot because there were a lot of air defense batteries in Eastern Europe. And one part of the war plan was to take mainly Polaris or Poseidon missiles and knock out those SAM sites so that the bombers could have a free corridor to go in. So that brought the required number of nuclear weapons down to 3,000. So, from 12,000 to 3,000 without changing the definition of deterrence or what warfighting was or anything at all. So, and then to jump ahead a little bit, in the Obama administration, they went through a very similar practice, a very similar exercise, where a guy in the Pentagon named Jim Miller, no relation to Frank, ran this thing. It was in the NSC. The commander of Strategic Command at the time came out like every 2 weeks for several months. And again, they went through every single target. Do we really need this as a target? What do we do? And at the time, there were 1,500 start countable nuclear weapons, probably really more like about 2,300. And they realized, they decided that, yeah, we could, and the military agreed, We could reduce this to 1,000 without any harm to national security, but we are not going to endorse that unless the Russians do the same. Now, New START had been signed, but after Russia annexed Crimea and started making incursions into eastern Ukraine, this just wasn't going to happen. And Obama was not inclined to do anything unilaterally, take any unilateral steps. And so he decided not to do it either. At one point, he revisited the question of whether we need, really, do we need all of our ICBMs? Can't we take out, one field, which would mean taking out 150 out of the 450? But the one that was most susceptible to that, there was a Montana senator, Democratic senator, who was up for a hard re-election, and removing the field would have meant the loss of a lot of jobs, so he didn't do it for political reasons. Then there was one other, and I think I'm going to wrap this up quickly. There was one other thing on this. To get New START passed, you might remember Obama had to trade in a lot. He had to spend more to get it ratified by the Senate. He had to spend more on the nuclear weapons enterprise. He had to agree to modernize weapons and so forth, which is an interesting thing to discuss more fully if you want. Throughout the history of arms control, nuclear arms control, it's very interesting. On the one hand, it's very good. It's been very good. It reduces tensions between the two sides. It creates forums where both sides can discuss things when they have nothing else to discuss. Provided a forum for rather intrusive inspection and verification. But in fact, it also spurred the arms race more than it controlled it. From the very beginning, even with SALT I and SALT II, the Joint Chiefs of Staff came up with lists. Okay, we will endorse this treaty if you agree to fund the following weapons. That's how almost every new weapon from the 70s on got funded. And so Obama did something a little clever, but not clever enough. He agreed that he would, quote, modernize or replace all three legs of the triad. Now, modernize could be, put in a new software or something like that. But the Republicans took this to mean replace. And you've probably seen estimates. Yep, we have to do all three legs of the triad. And this is going to cost $1.3 trillion over 30 years. And they would refer to this, and this is where they were just really clever. They would refer to this, starting with the Trump administration, as the Obama program of record. Phrasing it that way ensured that nobody, at least inside the government, would propose reducing it all because, well, hey, Obama agreed to this. So, but when in fact he didn't agree to it. He agreed to replace or modernize. So that's how we've come down to where we are. The fact is, and again, I've done a very rapid, I've left out a lot of very fun stories that we can go into if you want. But basically the point is that, we have three legs of the triad, mainly because we have three services. And what the Army was going to do ICBMs and the Air Force beat them out. So the Army was going to do ABMs, but then that whole thing fell apart because they didn't work. So we have that. The entire structure of targeting what was based on a very mechanical exercise, which has been changed only relatively recently. And third, nobody has really ever taken a comprehensive look at both from a policy point of view and then translated it into an operational view of what are you trying to deter? Okay, accepting the idea that if deterrence fails, you want to have some options besides just blowing everything up. How much of going down that road is really plausible? And what do you really need to do that? And part of the problem is that it's all, once you get into that level of thing, it's all so classified that there are people even working in the Pentagon, all this, who aren't cleared for on all of it. And in Congress, really nobody is. I mean, you've probably seen or heard some hearings on nuclear stuff, and it's all just, cliche and bluster, and it has nothing to do with any of the sort of oversight that is given to any other department. And I'll just say one more thing, just to talk about the entire Department of Defense, and then I'll open up questions. If you look at the defense budget, going back to the mid-60s, except for a couple of years in the Obama administration, when things tried to get a little bit rational, you will find, if you look at Army, Navy, Air Force, forget about like other military or, stuff like that, but it is divided up 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, plus or minus 2 percentage points, from which you can infer one of two things. Either that the founding fathers of the Defense Department in 1947, when they allocated the roles and missions to each of the three services, were so prescient and brilliant that they lined it up so that from then until the next 60 years, 70 years, it would work out even division. Or the Department of Defense in many ways is a bureaucracy like almost any other bureaucracy. And the reason they came up with even division in the mid-60s is because they all got tired of being railroaded by McNamara, who came at them with all this systems analysis and so forth. And he also kind of played the services off one another. So when McNamara left, they all got together and said, okay, that's never going to happen again. Let's just agree that we will rub each other's back and protect each other and just come up with basically the same size of defense budget every year. So essentially, in your classes and so forth, I mean, it's good to talk about the logic of all this and what does deterrence mean and so forth. But just keep in mind that, as with many other fields of practical endeavor, that when it gets to the actual business of how this is done, a lot of it is bureaucratic momentum and bureaucratic self-interest and wishful thinking. So I will willing to take questions.
Great, thanks, Fred. That was really terrific. So the floor is open now for questions. So folks, please use the raise hand function in the participants tab in Zoom, or you can send a note in the chat to me or to the group. And I'll just sort of keep a queue, as is normally the case when we're in E40. Let me kick things off, Fred, while folks are getting themselves organized, and ask you, has there ever been an attempt to kind of institutionalize sort of review of the PSYOP in a way that doesn't require someone to get interested in it, like the Frank Miller story, and then go do it? Has it ever been tried? And if not, why? And if so, why not? Why didn't it work?
No, there really hasn't been. One thing, I mean, if you really do get into it, like target by target, weapon by weapon, it takes a lot of time. And no, it really, I mean, McNamara did it to some extent back at the beginning. Didn't happen again till Miller, and then Jim Miller under Obama. And no, there's been nothing like it since. So yeah, these conceptions, and then once it's done and wrapped in a bow and sealed up again and taken back to Omaha, it's assumed that, okay, everything's set now. We had the review, all's well, and it's very hard to penetrate that line. I mean, some people ask, well, why is Omaha in? I mean, SAC had started out in Omaha. And people thought, well, that's not a very good idea. It's going to be removed from the power center in Washington. It's going to be cut off. But in fact, LeMay liked it that way because he did his own stuff out there. and nobody understood it. He had the biggest computers anywhere, any place, people who actually knew how to do it, actually doing time on target planning and that kind of thing. It's very, very technical. The guys at the Joint Strategic Target Planning staff were really the only people who knew how to do this. And so they were left alone. He did his own stuff, and he preferred not to be interfered with. So the difficulty of having reviews like this was kind of by design.
Yeah. Great, thanks. So first up in the queue, we have Tyler Bowen. Tyler, over to you. If you want to turn your video on to ask your question. Great.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing this, coming here and sharing your stories with us and your book. I've read the book and it's very good. I have two questions and they're related to each other. There's also a book by Keir Lieber and Darryl Press out there now that has an alternative take on the development of nuclear strategy, which is that this was a coordinated attempt to gain first strike capability and escape the mutual vulnerability at the heart of mutually assured destruction. And then, so what is there a way that maybe from a bureaucratic level it looks like infighting, but from a top level policy perspective, this is actually, there's a logic of competition and of sort of geopolitical military competition running through
Yeah.
the development strategy.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because one thing I should have said is that the war plan all along, really until quite recently, has been a first strike plan. I mean, at the beginning, the Russians really didn't have enough to launch a first strike. So it was first strike in response to a conventional aggression. So it was always first strike. And yeah, for the reasons, one reason you pointed out, and I pointed out to some degree, that maybe if we waited for them to do a first strike, we wouldn't be able to get off a second strike. Launch under attack was, I mean, really until the 80s, it was assumed at SAC that we would do launch under attack. We weren't going to just withstand a first strike. If the Russians launched a first strike, we would launch one. And by the way, we assumed the Soviets would as well. In fact, one time during the brief period when I worked on Capitol Hill and had a security clearance, I asked the head of SAC at the time, I said, well, if they're going to launch on warning, why are we aiming warheads at their missile sites anyway, if they're just going to be empty by the time they get there? And he said, well, we don't want to give them a free ride, which I thought was kind of a stupid answer. But anyway, yeah, no, absolutely. You're right. I kind of went a little bit too much into the at the heart of this, and this was something that was agreed to by everybody. Yeah, this was first use, first strike. No president has ever said we're foregoing the right to do first use. Obama looked at it but decided not to say so publicly. He honestly didn't think that we really would be the first to use nuclear weapons, but he didn't want to declare that. One thing I should also say about mutual assured destruction, it's kind of nonsense. McNamara came up with the idea of assured destruction, which then some anti-assured destruction wag called mutual assured destruction, so that he could come up with the phrase MAD. It was just a political and economic gesture. The first time he came up with it was for the budget for 1964, and it was strictly to contain the appetite of the Air Force to build more weapons. That was it. And he said, we don't need any more weapons, to the point where we have enough weapons to destroy the 100 largest Soviet cities. And you've probably seen this knee of the curve diagram. Was it? Well, if you're aiming at cities, once you go beyond that point, you get
a flat
margin down. But he said in the top secret memo to the president, he goes, but if there is a nuclear war, this is not actually the way that the weapons would be used. And in fact, he had a breakdown. There were really only about 200 weapons that were aimed at urban industrial targets. All of the rest, thousands, were aimed at military targets. Now, a lot of these military targets were near cities or even in cities, so tens of millions of people would still get killed, but they were not aimed at population per se, as it said. So assured destruction was always a political, bureaucratic, economic device. It was never what actual US policy was, ever.
Great, thanks. Next, we have Heather Williams. Heather, if you want to turn on your video and ask your question.
Yep. Hi. Thank you. That was a really fascinating. I wanted to take you up on your offer to talk about the New START ratification process. And so from your argument, I can totally see this perspective. And I know it's the conventional wisdom that the only way to get New START ratified was to do this kind of horse trade in terms of investment in the enterprise and the modernization. As I say, I get that that's the conventional wisdom. At the same time, I can see the argument on the other side, which is if you are going to make these kinds of cuts in the arsenal, that you have to strengthen the credibility of what you still have left. And given that, so many of the platforms were aging, like the newest ICBM went in the ground in 1972, that you want to have some assurances that the replacement and modernization program will go through. So I feel kind of stuck on this because I can see the logics on both sides. So I was wondering if you could just say a bit more about where you stand on this, and if you found any specific kind of research or got any insights into one side or the other.
Well, I talked with plenty of people who think that, okay, let's say you want to maintain the ICBM leg of the triad for various reasons. You can do this with surface life extension programs for quite a while. You don't really need a whole new, we have B-52s. They're called B-52s. What are we up now, up to the B-52H? The plane itself, or at least some part of the plane, has been around since the 50s, right? Or at least the 60s. Some of the newer ones, they still work just fine. They're modified. Submarines, at some point you have to get a new submarine because the nuclear core, which fuels it, is just going to burn up. But do we need a new round of air-launched cruise missiles? Do we need a new bomber? Do we need ICBMs? And if we do need new ICBMs, do we really need 400? The argument for ICBMs now, it used to be, well, we need, weapons that have the power and the accuracy to destroy missiles in their silos. Now Trident IIs can do that. Trident IIs are aimed to do that. The argument now is that, well, if we don't have any ICBMs, the Russians could do a sneak attack and really get a lot of our stuff with just 6 weapons, maybe 12 weapons at 6 targets, submarine pens, a couple of bomber bases, National Control Authority, National Command Authority. And so we need to put more missile silos around the country as a sponge. They call it a sponge, so that the Russians realize they can't attack us without doing a major attack. And attacking 400 missile silos, that would be a major attack, and so they wouldn't do this. Well, first of all, this is coming from the same people who 30 years ago talked blithely about the Soviet Union using 2,000 warheads to attack 1,000 ICBM sites. But second, let's say that there's something to the theory. You really need 400? How about 40? Do you have 40 500 kiloton weapons landed in the United States? I think that would be viewed as a major attack. So do you really need all those ICBMs? I don't think so. But going back, more directly addressing your question, if you go back to SALT I, the list of things that the Joint Chiefs demanded in trade-off for endorsing it, it included the Trident II, it included a new bomber, it included sea-launched cruise missiles, which nobody in the Navy had even asked for at the time. If you look at the ratification process for every single strategic nuclear arms treaty that's happened, they always use it to argue for more. But New START, it didn't really cut that much. They were very minor cuts. The the more compelling thing about New START was the new verification procedures and the fact that it was a treaty. It did nothing to interfere with anybody's plans. And by the way, there's now the Trump administration, doesn't want to extend New START. I have never heard anybody make the case that we need more or certain kinds of weapons beyond what is allowed in New START. There's no such argument. So if you and even these new systems that we're planning to build, none of them really start getting deployed until a decade from now. So that would have been 20 years from New START. This wasn't something that was needed right away. So yeah, you could make the case that, okay, I just want to make sure that you're not embarked on a course toward unilateral disarmament, but that wasn't happening anyway. And the guy who was heading up the campaign to come up with all these bargaining chips, Senator John Kyle, KYL, he got everything that he wanted, and then he didn't vote for the treaty anyway. And I asked somebody who worked for him later, I said, how come he didn't vote for it? He gets everything that he wants. How come he didn't vote for it? He goes, well, he just doesn't like arms control. I mean, that's some people just don't like anything that puts any kind of restraints. Like John Bolton, he didn't like international law. He didn't want anything that could put any constraint on American sovereignty, even if the benefits of following it actually redounded to our benefit as well. So yeah, come up, make sure that we do that, but they pile it on much more than what anything. If New START didn't exist, okay, it would be very hard to make the case for $1 trillion in new spending on nuclear weapons. And in fact, the reason why New START did exist, you might remember, it was in the election year, the midterm elections. Republicans won a lot. If ratification had waited until the new Senate came into their seats, Obama would not have gotten the 2/3 majority that he needed. And therefore, Kyle told McConnell, let's get a vote before the new Senate comes. It had gotten to the point where the Democrats wanted the treaty and knew they couldn't get it without the modernization. The Republicans wanted the modernization, knew they couldn't get it without the treaty. So they pushed up the ratification vote so that it would pass, so that then they would use that as the fulcrum for getting modernization. So it becomes very complicated in that respect.
Fascinating. Next we have Barry Posen. Barry, if you want to turn your video on and ask your question.
I think the video is on again, isn't it?
Yeah.
Hello, Barry.
Hey, Fred, how you doing? So I noticed that Steve Van Ever asked a similar question in the little chat function. I wonder if, in going through all this, you learned anything about the relationship of America's strategic nuclear weapons to the theater nuclear weapons in Europe. It got to be a pretty big force.
Mhm.
And towards the end of the Cold War, it had some pretty fancy, really strategic weapons based in Europe.
Yeah.
Ostensibly, these all went in also as part of the problem of making it credible that we would escalate. But my general perception of the literature on this is that most of the people who've gotten interested in nuclear weapons have voted with their pens or their feet or their typewriters to go to the strategic. And it seems like we don't quite know enough about those forces. So I wonder if anything in your explorations, you learned anything that kind of made you go, well, that's kind of interesting. Another article, another book in that, or something like that. Thanks.
Good, that's good. Well, as you know, Barry, and some of you also know, I mean, at one point we had 7,000 nuclear weapons in Western Europe. And we had a lot in South Korea. At our peak in the late 60s, we had a total of, I believe, might be getting this a little bit off, but about 36,000 nuclear weapons. And most of those were theater nuclear weapons. In Europe, in South Korea, on ships, on surface ships. And yeah, this had kind of all just kind of risen. It came from back in the time when, before we had intercontinental, it was a Frankenstein creature, really. And they were targeting even kind of apart from the PSYOP. They weren't even part of it. They had their own commanders. I mean, it was really kind of insane. And when you have to give George H.W. Bush credit for this. One thing that he did as part of, around the same time as START began, when he did a lot of unilateral things. You might recall he took bombers off of runway alert. The Cold War was pretty much wrapping up. He took bombers off of runway alert. He also just unilaterally dismantled almost all of the nuclear stuff in Europe, took them out of South Korea, which then instigated genuine diplomacy with North Korea, and off of surface ships. And actually, the commanders in the field and the admirals and captains at sea heaved a sigh of relief. This had become a total nuisance. There were ships that could not port in certain harbors because they had nuclear weapons on them. The commanders in the field in Europe were worried, spending more of their time worried about the security of their nuclear weapons than the actual security that they were coming up with. Now, it's very interesting. We still left 180 weapons in Europe, including about 50 in Turkey, which some people are now saying, oh shit, I wish we went out and done that. Early on in the Obama administration, his ambassador to NATO, Ivo Daalder, made a suggestion. Obama had said that he wanted to reduce the role of nuclear weapons in national security. He goes, I have an idea. Why don't we just unilaterally cut the number of our nuclear weapons in Europe in half? They have no military utility anymore anyway. And it would be a good sign that, yeah, we really don't, we're reducing the role of nuclear weapons in national security affairs. And Hillary Clinton, we were then involved in New START negotiations. Hillary Clinton said, we're engaged in bilateral negotiations with Russia. It wasn't about theater stuff at all. It's not a good idea to do unilateral cuts while we're engaged in bilateral talks. It might reduce their incentive to make cuts themselves. And Obama went along with that. It is nuts. Now that we pulled out of the INF Treaty because the Russians were technically violating it to some extent, who could be happier than the Russians? They always hated that treaty. And I asked a couple of people in the Pentagon, I said, okay, then we said, okay, we're going to develop a new medium range missile, because now we can. And I asked them, I said, well, what's the plan for this missile? What kind of missions do you have in mind right now? Where are you going to base them? Because, you can have medium range missiles at sea or in submarines. That's not prohibited by INF, but where's it going to go? And he said, well, we haven't figured that out yet. Haven't figured out targets, haven't discussed with allies where it's going to be. In other words, it's like, we can do this, so we're going to do it. I mean, it's just ass backwards. So but it's a good example of how you can get caught in this frenzy. I would make the case. I mean, even if you're not in favor of minimum deterrence, who cares what the Russians or Chinese do? Come up with as many nuclear weapons as you think you need in a variety of contingencies, and make sure that they're secure and they can be reliably launched and not launched, and give everybody the impression that you're actually willing to use these things, and then say, okay, that's all I need. It's basically what the Chinese do. They have like 300 nuclear weapons. They say, we don't need any more. So yeah, the whole thing is pretty whack. There might not be a lot of real good intellectual literature on this because it never did have any intellectual basis.
Great. Thank you. So we have time for one more question for the the live stream portion. And over to you, Eric Sand. Eric, if you want to turn on your video and ask your question.
Hey, thanks, Taylor. Fred, most of the story you've told has been about bureaucratic politics sort of dominating the day, but there have been a couple of times when rational points seem to maybe have had some influence, like the let's count the number of weapons we actually need. I'm just wondering, what do you think is the best example, if you have any, of a time where a rational argument influenced the debate about nuclear weapons strategy?
Okay, by the way, I should emphasize that my book, bureaucratic politics really aren't the centerpiece of the book. I just thought I'd focus on that because I remember taking courses on bureaucratic politics at MIT, and also just to kind of demystify the trade somewhat. In terms of it, just, well, look, I mean, look, the basic notion, you know, back in 1945, just a couple of months after Hiroshima, Bernard Brodie wrote an essay called The Absolute Weapon, in which he said, you know, in the past, our job has been to win a war. Now the idea might be to prevent one. How do we do that? And we have to have an ability to retaliate in kind. And this means having a force that is basically invulnerable, that can't be attacked, and that can be used to respond in kind to any Soviet attack. And you know, that's kind of endured. I mean, that's a rational position, and that's kind of bedrock nuclear deterrence theory, right? And it's certainly, in addition to being propelled by the Navy's desire to deliver a knockout blow to the Strategic Air Command, it did motivate things like the Polaris submarine and the Poseidon submarine, and hardening ICBMs in their silos, and quick evacuation from bomber bases and so forth. So it's not within the sphere. They're rational things. I think what's more rational, and I go into this in some detail in the book, there actually have been a number of crises, more than most people know, in which the use of nuclear weapons has been seriously contemplated. And in most of these instances, the president involved has immersed himself very deeply into the whole strategic rationale and the whole logic of it, and takes it very seriously. And at the end, his version of rationality has been to say, this really doesn't make sense. This is going to end in disaster. And the rational thing that he's done is to scramble out of the rabbit hole as fast as possible and to come up with some diplomatic solution that escapes the deterrence trap. I mean, one part of the deterrence trap is, okay, you need deterrence, but it has to be credible deterrent. What does that mean? It has to mean that the other side and your allies believe that you actually would use these things. And so therefore, you have to build certain kinds of weapons and design and rehearse certain kinds of plans that make it credible that you really would use them, that you're able to do this. And at some point, as this develops over the course of decades, at some point, the theory of credible deterrence and the theory of warfighting sort of intersect. They become synonymous. And where that leaves a president in the middle of a crisis is having to make a decision of whether to put that into effect. And the more that they learn about where this is going and the complete uncertainty about these theories and this ability to go tit for tat or whatever, and the strong likelihood that this is going to end in absolute catastrophe and chaos, then they reject all of it and try to shimmy out of it as much as possible. One thing, I'll tell you a joke that Bill Kaufman used to tell. He said that he and his pals, who all, you know, they hated people like LeMay and LeMay hated people like them. He said, what LeMay's you should have a guy like LeMay running Strategic Air Command. And then the job of the vice commander should be, if we ever really get into a dangerous situation, his job is to shoot LeMay. So that's kind of the situation. Is they don't shoot LeMay, but the president immerses himself in this rabbit hole of nuclear logic. And the way to avoid war is really to push it all aside as much as possible. So that's kind of says quite a bit about its operational utility.
Fascinating. Thanks. So thanks to everyone who's tuned in on the live stream. We're going to end the live stream portion now, but I ask everyone on the Zoom to stay on. So thanks very much for tuning in.